Brazilians hate the national team. And that might be true to some, but I may be blowing it out of proportion. After all, hate is a very strong word. There ain't many things that we hate. However, there has been a growing disinterest for the national team in Brazil. Of course, the Seleção Brasileira is still very popular, but not as much as they once were. Or maybe, let me rephrase that. The fans don't care about the Seleção or the national team as much as they used to. And why is that? Hello. If you're new here, I'm Filippo, and welcome to Chapéu Football, where we cover everything Brazilian football related on YouTube in English. So make sure you're subscribed for that. Today I want to dive into why Brazilian football fans have lost some interest in the national team. First, I want to address why am I even talking about this with some opinions, facts, and data. Then I'm going to give you 3 reasons why fans have lost interest in the national team over the past few years. And I'll end the video with my final thoughts and how this can and will change. The club culture in Brazil is still there. The fans love Flamengo, Palmeiras, Corinthians, Cruzeiro, but Brazilians have tuned out a bit when it comes to the national team outside of the World Cup and even in the World Cup. And you're going to say, well, it's because the national team has been losing. I'm going to debunk that during the video. That obviously plays a role, right? Winning, people like winning, but that is not the main reason why they've been losing interest in the national team. It's not because they're losing, even though losing 7-1 at home to Germany in 2014 has done irreparable damage. It just feels like other national teams, specifically in South America like Colombia, Argentina, they're much more passionate about their own national teams when compared to Brazil. Now make sure to drop a like in this video if you haven't already. It helps the channel quite a bit. Subscribe and let us know in the comment section down below your thoughts on this topic. And let's begin. Okay, so let's start with why am I even talking about this? First and foremost, it's a personal feeling of mine, where it feels like Brazilians care less about the national team when compared to my childhood in the 2000s. It feels like that started to change after 2014. I wonder why, and you may be saying that 7-1 loss has made everyone tune out of the Seleção Brasileira, but that's not true. That is actually not true, and I'll show you very soon why. And if you are a fan of the Seleção, you know that it just feels like something is off, and Brazilians don't connect with the national team like they used to. So with that said, I started to dig into this, and I found many articles on it, including researches and polls, which led me to believe that maybe what I'm feeling and seeing is true, because I'm not the only one that is saying this. So in September of 2025, recently, O Globo had a poll where they asked over 2,000 fans, or people in general, from different locations in Brazil to rate from 1 to 10 how fanatic they were for the national team, where only 15.9% voted 9 or 10, which is a fanatic, while almost 50% voted between 0 and 4, which is essentially barely caring about the national team. For context, when they asked the same question to these people about their club teams, over 33% voted 9 or 10. Remember how many voted for the national team? Around 15.9, which means more than twice the amount compared to the national team when they voted 9 to 10 for the club. Did that make any sense to you? So when it was club, over 33% voted that they're a fanatic. When it was national team, less than 16, showing that there's a clear culture right now of club over country, which in the past, it was a bit more balanced. Okay, now Datafolha also did a research measuring the interest on the national team from 2002, or the 2002 World Cup, all the way to the 2022 World Cup in Qatar. Now the navy blue line means large interest, while the red line means no interest. And the results are fascinating. In 2002, the large interest line was at 42%. Then it increased to 51% in 2006, and it went back to 42% in 2010. Since then, it has crashed harder than home prices in the United States back in 2008. The 2022 World Cup measured only 22% at the dark blue line, which means only 22% of the fans there had a large interest in the Seleção Brasileira during the World Cup, while the red line which shows no interest, went from 22% in 2002, which is not bad, to just 10% in 2006, which is great. It means a very small amount of fans didn't care about the Seleção. But then it shot up to 51% in 2022. The chart essentially flipped between those with a strong interest to no interest, which is quite concerning. So just to recap what I just said, it was around 50% the large interest according to Datafolha, and the low interest was around 20% in 2002. That has flipped, where now the lack of interest is around 50% and the strong interest is around 20%. So what is the reason for that? Why is this happening? Which is kind of bizarre, right? The passion for the sport is still there in Brazil, and fans love their clubs more than ever. But why don't they love the Seleção or have interest in the Seleção as much as they used to? I have 3 reasons that I believe play a role into this, or I guess 3 theories, and that's what I want to dive into right now. And you can make sure to drop a like in this video if you haven't already, and make sure to drop a comment down below with your thoughts on this topic. Oh, and obviously subscribe. Okay, reason number 1, and I'm about to open a can of worms here because people are going to be pissed off, because they always are when we talk about this. I'm about to poke a bear, which is politics. Recent turmoil in politics in Brazil specifically has played a role, or a negative role, in the Seleção Brasileira. And understand, I'm not here to pick sides. I haven't lived in Brazil forever. I only lived there as a kid, so I have no strong opinions when it comes to Brazilian politics. And to me, the right, the left, to me, they're just different cheeks of the same butt. And not a good butt, a terrible butt. It doesn't really matter in that sense. But let me explain to you what I mean about politics. So Jair Bolsonaro, which is the right-wing candidate in Brazil, when he had, I guess, rallies or protests, the fans or his followers would wear Brazilian national team jerseys to show their love for the country, which is fine. They can wear whatever they want, and that jersey represents every Brazilian. The problem is, because the country is so divided, just like the United States of America, those who are left-wingers, or that vote for Lula, for example, the current president of Brazil, they didn't like that. So they wouldn't wear the Brazilian national team jersey, because if you're wearing the jersey, it meant you were supporting Jair Bolsonaro. So that created a bit of a divide within the fan base, right? And that could increase the lack of interest in the national team. On top of that, Neymar, back in 2022, I think, he showed support for Jair Bolsonaro, which in that sense increased the rejection of fans that were, I guess, left-leaning towards the national team. They started to hate because Neymar was the face of the national team. Now, once again, I don't see an issue if a player wants to endorse one candidate or the other, but that led to issues. Brazil is a very divided country these days when it comes to politics, and that's why that's a problem. Even when Brazil was going to launch, or allegedly launch, a red jersey, there was a lot of drama because that's the color of the party of Lula, right? The current president, which is on the left wing, so people from the right wing were pissed off. As you can see, if you do something that goes towards the left, the right gets pissed. If you do something that goes towards the right, the left gets pissed. You can't please both sides. Now, I just want to make one thing clear. Out of the 3 reasons that I'm going to talk about in this video, this one is the smallest one, but I firmly believe that it played a role. Now, if we really want to spice things up here in this video, let me know in the comment section down below. Who did you vote for? Lula or Bolsonaro? Oh boy, this is gonna make the comment section very spicy. But do it anyway. Reason number 2, and to me, you're going to want to pay attention, because to me, this one's the biggest one of them all. The current fans don't identify with the current generation of players. Therefore, they end up not really identifying or caring as much about the national team. And there are several reasons to why, and let me tell you which ones matter. So Brazilian football fans are more connected with the clubs because it's more community oriented. And not having or barely having players from the Brazilian clubs in the national team has slowly destroyed that connection between the club fans and the national team. On top of that, the players leave Brazil way too early these days. So being in Europe, you can still have a strong connection to a Brazilian club if you don't leave so early. Like, look at Coutinho, Vinicius Júnior, Rodrigo, Endrick, Estevão. These are players that they don't stay long enough with their clubs to build a real connection. They leave when they're like 18, 19. Well, in the past, if you go way back to like the 70s, 60s, players wouldn't even leave Brazil. But then in the 80s, some of them started to go to Europe. In the 90s, it increased, 2000s even more. But for example, Zico played in Italy at some point in his career. But he was already a Flamengo legend. So if he went to the national team, Flamengo fans would feel connected, right? That's just one of many examples. So in the past, like 20, 30 years ago, we had players going to Europe, but they would stay in Brazil till they were 22, 23, some 24, and they would build a connection with the club. Nowadays, players leave when they're freaking teenagers, and there's no connection. So look at this. I have some stats for you. In the 50s, 60s, 70s, and honestly even the 80s, the national team of Brazil was pretty much only players playing in Brazil with a few exceptions here and there. But then we gotta go to the 90s, where more Brazilians started to move abroad and play in Europe. Like in 1994, when Brazil won the World Cup, 11 players in the roster played in Brazil, like about half of it. And the ones that didn't, they didn't leave Brazil so early, so there was a connection between the fans and even the players that were playing in Europe, like Romário, for example. Now, in 2002, when Brazil won the World Cup again, there were 13 players in that roster that played in the Brazilian league. 13, okay? And back then, you only brought 23 players to the World Cup. So that's over half of that team or half of that roster played in Brazil. Now in 2006, things started to change a lot. Only 3 Brazilians, or only 3 players in the Brazilian national team played in the Brazilian league. In 2010, we also only had 3 players that played for Brazilian clubs that were in the national team for the World Cup. In 2014, we had just 4. And most of them were not important players besides Fred, that was a starter as a center forward. In 2018, we also only had 3 players. And in 2022, once again, we had only 3 players that played for Brazilian clubs in the Brazilian national team that played in the World Cup. So, as you can see, the less Brazilian clubs are represented in the national team, the interest went lower. Go back to the graph that I showed you and notice how from 2002 till now, the interest started to go lower because one of the main reasons is the fans don't feel identified with the national team as they used to be. Isn't it funny how that graph from 2002 till 2022, it started to go down? And I just gave you the numbers, how 2002, we had 13 players playing for the Brazilian clubs in the national team. Now, 2006, there was still interest because we had just won the World Cup in 2002. But since, it's been crashing down. Why? Because we've had like 3 players from Brazilian clubs playing in the World Cup since, right? Every edition, we have like 3 guys. On top of that, I want to add that the current generation is much more unlikable than previous ones. You don't have players that we would call players that were raiz from back then. Guys like Ronaldo, Ronaldinho, Rivaldo, even Kaká, Roberto Carlos, Dunga. We don't have those guys like we used to, which makes the national team a bit more unlikable. But the main reason is that disconnect, that we don't have players from Brazilian clubs playing with the Seleção, so the fans don't identify with it as much as they used to, because the interest in football in Brazil is as big as it's ever been when it comes to clubs, right? The fans are still with the clubs. Reason number 3 is one that you watching this video probably mentioned, which is losing. The Brazilian national team has been losing a lot more than they were in the 90s and, the early 2000s. And if you go back to the 70s, not 70s, but 60s. However, I do think that plays a role because losing does lead to some people losing interest. I just don't think it plays that big of a role. I want to kind of say that it is a reason, but it's a very small reason. Let me explain. If losing alone was the problem, why didn't the Seleção lose interest from 1974 till 1990, where they were losing a lot? You know why? The reason why they didn't lose that much interest from 1974 to 1990 was because during that time, they still had a lot of players in Brazilian clubs, if not pretty much the entire roster of the Seleção, being composed of players that played for clubs in Brazil. For Flamengo, Fluminense, Palmeiras, Corinthians, São Paulo, the list goes on. Crazy, right? So they were losing. Brazil didn't do well from 74 all the way to 1990, even though they had a brilliant national team under Tele Santana that should have won a World Cup but didn't. but people didn't lose interest, even though they were losing. And understand, I'm not arguing that losing doesn't play a role. It obviously is one of the reasons, especially with the younger generation of fans, right? Because they want to win. However, the attachment for a team or for a club is usually unbreakable and unconditional. It doesn't really depend whether or not you're winning. Because, look, if you are a fan of a club in Brazil, your team could get relegated. Your team could lose to everyone. You still continue to be a fan of that club, even if they suck for 10, 20, 30 years. Listen to this. I lived a few years in Rio de Janeiro, and I have a lot of friends that are like Vasco, Botafogo fans. Now, Botafogo was good last year, but Botafogo struggled for like 20 years, 30 years. They've been really bad. But all those fans, they stick around. Vasco da Gama has been abysmal. They've been terrible. But my friends that are Vasco fans, they're still Vasco fans. You will be a fan of that team and you won't lose interest no matter how bad they are. So my overall point with the Seleção is, with the clubs, the fans feel connected, right? It's their community. It goes from their grandfather to their dad. They live there. With the Seleção, it has to be bigger than that. You need the players in there. Losing plays a role, but losing is not the main reason why they're losing interest in the national team. The fans are losing interest in the national team. Okay, so what are my final thoughts on this topic? I think things will change. What's happening right now is the Brazilian league has been growing more than ever financially. It's getting stronger and stronger. We made 1 or 2 videos about that you can check out, why money's so big there. The quality is going up, and I think over the next 4 to 8 to 12 years, the number of Brazilian national team players or that play in Brazil, right, that play for Brazilian clubs will grow. Once that grows, some of that connection will come back. On top of that, I do believe that winning will help bring some interest. So there's 2 things that need to happen. We need to have a few more players that play in Brazil playing for the Seleção. That's one thing. The other one is they have to start winning. So if over the next 8 years, we go from 3 players from Brazilian clubs in the national team in the World Cup to, let's say, 10, which would be close to half of the roster, and we win 1 World Cup, the interest will start to ramp back up. Until then, this trend of people and fans losing interest will continue to go up. Now, I want to make one thing clear. If you're not Brazilian, if you haven't been to Brazil, there's still a large interest for the Seleção Brasileira. And when the World Cup comes, everyone's watching, everyone cares. It's just that it's been going lower over the past 20 years, as I showed. But don't think that people don't care. They care. And when I said that they hate the national team, yeah, there's definitely people that hate the national team, but it's not really hate, it's more of disinterest. Alright everyone, thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to drop a like before you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section, of course, and subscribe to help us grow as we approach the World Cup, and we will be covering the Seleção Brasileira in the World Cup extensively. Thank you very much for watching, and have a great day.